It's Sunday, August 4, 2024. I'm Anthony Davis. Welcome to the Weekend Show, where we make the time to consider the news of the week. You can support my work and independent journalism at patreon.com/5Minute News. Our guest today is a former FBI Deputy Assistant Director and co-host of the Cleanup on Aisle 45 podcast, Peter Strzok. Welcome back to the Weekend Show.
Anthony, thank you. It's great to be back with you.
We have a lot to talk about. Donald Trump's racism is one of them, and I'm sure that there's a lot to say there. But first, I want to focus on you for a second, only because you are in the headlines again, unfortunately or fortunately. I don't quite know how you handle all that stuff, but I want to ask you about the news that the Justice Department has reached a settlement with FBI officials whose texts infuriated Donald Trump, and of course they're referring to you and the former FBI attorney, Lisa Page. This is a case that Donald Trump kind of weaponized, really, and kept referring to you in derogatory language and was claiming that you had a vendetta and therefore the FBI had a vendetta against him back when you were central in the Russia investigation. Just tell us in your words, really, how this is playing out and how you feel about this latest decision.
Oh, well, thanks. I mean, look, I think it's certainly a vindication. It's been a long time coming. I mean, this lawsuit was filed in 2019 and aspects of it continue. But at least with regard to the settlement, it involves some actions taken by the Department of Justice shortly at the end of 2017, where they brought in a bunch of reporters and took texts that were, very private in nature and intended to remain private, and essentially laid it out to the entirety of both print media, television media, and online media, and doing that in advance of the then Deputy Director Rod Rosenstein going up to the Hill to testify. And so, we filed suit saying, this behavior is prohibited under the Privacy Act, that it, in fact, Anthony, this is a preview. If people are concerned what a second Trump administration would look like, what a weaponization of the government, what sort of the politicization and abuse of the federal civil service. This is exactly, we don't have to speculate because Trump did, in fact, engage in a lot of this behavior the first time around. I have no doubt that in the future, another Trump administration would be far more abusive and reach many more people, rather. But at least in this instance, we alleged in our lawsuit that two things happened. One, the DOJ violated Privacy Act by releasing these, and that two, that when I was subsequently fired, that was illegal, that they had violated the Constitution when they did that. And that aspect of the lawsuit continues. But certainly with regard to the texts, I mean, and it's typical that DOJ, when they reach a settlement, they, neither admit nor deny anything. And so in this case, they were not admitting any guilt whatsoever. But what was particularly gratifying was, I think about 3 weeks ago, Attorney General Merrick Garland was on the Hill, was testifying in the House, and Jim Jordan was kind of pestering him about, he had heard that there was a settlement, that there was some sort of payoff, that people are getting rewarded. And the Attorney General in sworn testimony said, no, when DOJ breaks the law, we have to pay. And so I think, the fact that this settlement occurred, the amount of the settlement, I think certainly sends a very clear message about how bad this behavior by Trump's Department of Justice was. And I do hope it serves as sort of a deterrent, as a warning to future abuses, to hopefully prevent those and to protect, civil servants who go in every single day across the United States and do good work for the American people. So I feel vindicated. We've got a long path to go still with the remaining claims, but at the moment I'm pleased with the settlement.
Let's talk to the idea that obviously FBI employees and all government officials at whatever level have a professional life and a personal life. And professional people hopefully should keep them separate. I want to talk to this notion that Donald Trump, through Project 2025, wants to replace government workers, the FBI included, with Trump loyalists, with people that answer only to him, who are politically aligned with him, who are MAGA Republicans and in many cases conspiracy theorists and, everything that goes with that group. Because he is trying to convince people that the FBI, as one of these institutions, is the deep state, and the fact that you have people who have political leanings that are not aligned with the president means that they can't do their job, means that they're going to turn on the supreme leader as he sees himself. Can you just explain to people who don't maybe understand what it's like to be working at a high level in the FBI, or indeed in any position in the government, and how you separate those things?
Sure. Well, I mean, the fact is, for as long as we've had government employees, those employees do have, as you indicated, personal lives. People go out and vote. People have opinions. People are Republicans. People are Democrats. Some are very engaged. Some register with the party. Most probably don't. But the fact of the matter is, whether it's a government employee or whether it's somebody in the military, with the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, people go and vote, but at the same time understand that they've taken an oath to the Constitution and to the American people. So when it comes down to it, it doesn't, the idea that, and I didn't at the working level. I mean, certainly when you get to a cabinet level official, I mean, those people are appointees. They're confirmed by the Senate. They certainly take a policy agenda based on the direction of the president, and appropriately so. I mean, we elect presidents, and we, by that election, expect them to put in place whatever policies that they've said they will do to get our vote. But when it comes down to the implementation of that, there's so much of what the government does on a day-to-day basis. And I'll talk about the FBI in a little bit, but everything from somebody in the Park Service who is either a ranger on the ground in a national park, all the way up to somebody at the National Park Service headquarters who's making sure they have sufficient funding and are hiring in the right way. People in the USDA who are looking and inspecting meat and vegetables and making sure the things that we're buying from the supermarket are safe. There are thousands of people, all the people who deliver your mail, and or like Louis DeJoy, who we saw very clearly didn't know what he was doing. But I think a lot of Americans, not that they take it for granted, but they don't appreciate how deeply the professionals in the government actually are embedded in their everyday lives. And those people, there's a certain expertise that is necessary with that. I mean, you or I could not just watch a YouTube video, go into a slaughterhouse and figure out whether, beef is being stored properly. We could not, read a couple of books and go out and look at, workplace safety and figure out whether or not there's an OSHA violation. There are people who are trained and spend their entire lives doing these jobs. And in the case of the FBI, there are people you come in, you're trained as an agent, you begin as a very junior agent, doing investigations of fairly simple complexity, and you gain experience and expertise in whatever it is, whether you're looking at a Russian foreign intelligence officer, whether you're looking at an Al-Qaeda operative, whether you're looking at some, Wall Street traders who are engaging potentially in, financial institution fraud. There's an expertise that comes with that and is needed. And, whether you're investigating it, whether you're supervising 14 agents who are investigating it, whether you're running a field office that are doing all of these investigations, you can't just step in if you're Donald Trump and say, well, I understand, Mr. Special Agent in charge, you've worked up to this, got to distinguish yourself amongst your peers over 20 years. But I've got somebody who is a big donor out of, Omaha, Nebraska, and they're a real loyalist. And so I'm going to put them in charge here. They do not have the skills or the expertise or the experience to do any successful, effort in that job. So I hear some of this Project 2025, discussion, and I understand what it is he wants to do. And the other thing is, we had early on in our civil service, almost a patronage system, which is corruption is endemic to that process. If a spoil for political patronage is an award of a job within the government, that is going to bring along with it a certain both incompetence and corruption that is not going to serve the American public well at all. And so a lot of what you saw throughout, particularly in the late 1800s, early 1900s, was the professionalization of our civil service, the creation of a true independent group of government employees who go out and do their job without regard to whether the president is red or blue, and they just go out and do a good job. Now, those same people are going to vote, right? Don't get me wrong. They're going to go out and they're going to vote for one candidate or the other, but it isn't like, well, I voted for the red candidate and the blue candidate won, therefore I'm not going to do my job for 4 years.
But this is what Trump wants us to think, isn't it? This is the projection, because if he was working in the government, if he could even get a security clearance, which is probably not the case, he would be entirely politically aligned. He wouldn't be able to separate the notion of personal and professional. He's just not built that way. So he projects to make other people think that everyone else is as corrupt as he is. And that must have had quite a negative effect on the civil service, just knowing that he is projecting this language that is devaluing their efforts.
Well, it certainly has an impact. I mean, people go in and they do their job, but you can't tune out the outside world. I mean, it is inevitable when it shows up on the television or, the nightly news or in social media, you see some of the statements he's making. And you're right. I mean, in almost every instance, the accusations he would make were in fact confessions. Right. The allegation, there's a deep state doing all these horrible things. Most of us would heard that the first few times. They're like, what are you talking about? That's impossible. It would never happen that way. But then come to find out, those were exactly the things that he was doing. And so it kind of cuts badly both ways, right? There's one, you can't envision it if you're on the inside, that I can't ever see doing things that way. I can't envision anybody acting that way. But yet on his side, he is in fact behaving that way and doing those bad things. So it's a pernicious cycle. And I think across the board, we still see to this day government agencies which are afraid to do things which are going to arouse the ire of Trump and MAGA Nation. And that's not to anybody's benefit, but it's still, unfortunately, a reality.
I want to talk about the shooting and all of the drama associated with that in just a little while. First, though, I just want to react to something that you just said about government agencies and expertise, because there was a landmark ruling in the Supreme Court in late June where the Chevron case I'm referring to, cutting back on the power of federal agencies to interpret the laws that they administer, and ruling that the courts should rely on their own interpretation of the laws. And this decision is going to have far-reaching effects right across the country, from environmental regulation, as in, the water we drink and the air that we breathe, to healthcare costs, for example. And, this was a 6-3 case in the Supreme Court, with, of course, the Republican justices voting for this because it backs up their support of big business, takes away regulation, and enables even more price gouging, profiteering, and corruption at the highest levels. This is the pox of Trumpism, isn't it? This is the effect of Trumpism, his Supreme Court placements and the corruption that we're seeing in the Supreme Court. Do you think people understand the importance of this Chevron case and why its reversal is so detrimental to modern society?
Not yet. I mean, I think it's going to take some time. I mean, look, the reality is that the majority of the Supreme Court has been appointed by presidents who lost the popular vote. So let that sink in. The majority of the Supreme Court justices were appointed by people who did not receive the majority of the presidential vote. So they don't speak for the majority of Americans. And I think some of it, that Chevron, I think the decision, which if I recall correctly was authored by Justice Alito, in fact contained, not a typo, but used the wrong definition. They used the word nitrous oxide when they were looking for a different chemical compound. Nitrous oxide is laughing gas. The chemical at issue was something slightly different, but it goes to the point that judges are not experts. They are experts in the law. They're experts in applying the law to a fact pattern, but they are not the sort of folks who can go out and look at a complex issue, whether it is talking about a chemical manufacturer. We just saw what's very interesting is in some of the content moderation. There was another Supreme Court case, and I'm forgetting the name of the decision that came out this term as well, but that essentially was talking about the role and how whether or not the government should be interacting, jawboning is the term, right? Whether they should be influencing or providing information to social media companies. And if so, what sort of constraints should exist around that? Now, it came out through this, I think Judge Doty, I think was his name, and I think he was Louisiana, issued on the 4th of July, this huge ruling that was full of just absolutely incorrect technical information. It was appealed, went to the Fifth Circuit. and again, which incorporated still that very shoddy raw data. And then finally, when the Supreme Court took a look at it and finally issued their ruling, took both the District Court and the Circuit Court of Appeals Court to task for saying, look, this is garbage data that you have in here. And so the point being, at the end of the day, you have to rely on the expertise of people outside to be able to do their jobs. And if you don't, you risk, one, overwhelming the court system, because if every single little contentious issue cannot be decided by an agency and instead has to go in front of a judge who potentially has no background whatsoever, who needs to be briefed, and maybe he's briefed well, or maybe he's briefed poorly. And so, people have to determine what the facts are. All of this slows things down. But Anthony, I think there was a lot of takeaway about, this last Supreme Court term really enhanced the power of the presidency. And I do think that's true. I mean, I think the immunity ruling for Trump was horrible. But the bigger winner than the presidency were the courts, and in particular the Supreme Court. Because at the end of the day, they said, yes, in the case of, Chevron, the courts will decide these things. But even with the presidency, even given that they said the president would have these extraordinary amounts of immunity, at the end of the day, the people who will decide whether or not that standard fits or not is not the president. It's going to be the Supreme Court. So while I think a lot of folks were focusing on what the Supreme Court gave to Donald Trump in particular, I think these sort of quieter, bigger messages, the amount of power it continues to sort of accumulate around the court itself. And when it comes to Chevron, I mean, these are again, much like talking about, what does the government actually do in your everyday life? It's profound, but hard to see. I mean, it's like you can drive on a federal highway without a pothole. Your mail shows up generally on time. You can go and, buy food at the supermarket that doesn't make you sick. You can get on an elevator without it constantly, coming off the rails and falling to the ground and injuring you. You can drive in your car, and if you get in an accident, the airbag works. All these things come about because of the government, because of expertise. And to the extent there's any sort of regulatory aspect to that, to take it out of the way it has worked for generations, I think is going to be profound, but I think it's going to take us, it's like global warming. I mean, there is no doubt at the end of the day, it is going to have a horrible end result, but it is difficult to see on a day-by-day basis just the slow, horrible shift that we're in. So we might see a case that manifests like, oh, that's a horrible result, but it's very hard to scope out and see the totality of really negative impact, in my opinion, that's going to come out of Chevron.
I suppose the word that you use that really chimes with me the most is expertise. And this is a kind of slow destruction of expertise at a senior level, where not just the president, as in the disgraced former president, never cared for expertise, to the extent that COVID was a disaster under him, or that he drew a Sharpie line to show the trajectory of a storm to save face. I mean, just awful things. And yet it's so important. Like, when you meet someone randomly who is an expert or highly educated or just has a really interesting niche job, they're the most incredible people you'll ever meet. And yet these are the very people that Donald Trump and a future Trump presidency wants nothing to do with. And so to this kind of gradual erosion of expertise, of course, you have plenty, certainly when it came to the Russia probe and all of your efforts there. And Donald Trump's version was, well, I spoke to Vladimir Putin myself, and he said he didn't meddle in the election, so who am I supposed to believe, him or the security services? He chose Putin, incidentally, for those that missed that moment in Helsinki. So what is it about like deregulation and a distaste for expertise that the Republicans are peddling that people seem to be buying?
Well, I think it's a notion of, again, creating an us versus them environment. It is not something where we all come together as a nation. We're a diverse nation. Our diversity gives us strength. There is a sense of meritocracy that if you go out and you work hard, that we want to try and give everybody an equal opportunity. And with that equal opportunity, with effort, we can all get ahead. This is a creation of not creation. I mean, I do think there's a certain division. But I think it is a large continuing shift of power away from sort of the rural areas of the United States into the urban areas of the United States, and that within the rural areas, individual farmers or small towns are, kind of being bought out and replaced by, whether it's large farm corporations or whatever the case may be. I think, and also there's, frankly, I think a racial shift in what is traditionally a white male sort of, predominant holding of power in the United States and moving into a much more sort of diverse environment. And anytime you get that, I think it does create division. And I think Donald Trump and his populism in particular is playing to and encouraging that division. And some of that division is not, it's easy to label things, right? Well, you've got the immigrants and they're bad and they're killing people and they're taking your job. You have the elites, those smart people on the coast who think they know better than you and they've got all their education and they don't, they think they're going to solve all your problems, but really all they're doing is taking care of themselves. That sort of message resonates. And unfortunately, the trickle over is Anthony Fauci and do your own research, and if you want to take ivermectin, if you want to inject bleach, you're just as smart as some not only doctor but an entire field of epidemiologists and physicians who can sit there and say, okay, over the path of modern medicine over the past 100 years where we've eradicated polio, and suddenly now we're like talking about, Donald Trump saying, I'm not going to give money to any school that has a vaccine mandate. So congratulations that we're back to the age of mumps, measles, rubella, all these horrible things that we decided 140 years ago were bad, but all because it's like, well, this expertise somehow is bad. And what's from a sort of counterintelligence perspective, what's interesting is a lot of these sort of themes are themes that are used by authoritarians. You can look and you can see it, whether it is in Putin's Russia, if you look at authoritarians around the world, current and past, a lot of this idea of expertise in some ways correlates with the truth, right? There are people who have expertise and they're experts because they know what they're doing. If a doctor says something, that's the truth because he's a doctor. If an economist says something, she knows what she's saying because she has an expertise in that. If, and so this knowledge, the idea that there is a common truth that we can all agree to and say, these are the facts, that doesn't suit the authoritarian. The authoritarian wants you to only believe what they're saying, only their spin. There isn't, the fake news, but, you could tune in one point in time to Walter Cronkite or pick up the New York Times, and that was the truth. The evening news was fact. Oh, now it's all fake news. So all of these things, all of these experts in the deep state, in the doctors with COVID, with the fake news, it's all, there is no truth, sort of the, fancy word, the epistemic order, the truth-based order that underpins democracy, because we can all sit down and agree these are the facts, and therefore let's vote on or agree upon or not about what we want to do. If you do away with that truth, well, then, what you've got left is the authoritarian. Anthony, you believe one set of facts. I believe one set of facts. Our neighbors believe a third set of facts. There isn't really any agreed upon set of facts. So we've got to look to the leader to tell us. And so that is, there's this really from a, again, a political science perspective, from an international relations perspective, from, looking at what one of the things that Russian and Soviet disinformation always tried to do was to attack the same thing, to attack the truth. That was one of the purposes of disinformation and active measures, to try and erode this common acceptance of the truth. And again, it does it to undermine democracy. And at the same time, it's also boosting the potential power of an authoritarian. So I think there's a lot that goes into it. Do I think Trump has the first set of, would be able to think any of those things? No, I don't. I think he just wants to say, whatever comes out of his mouth. And I don't know that he is listening to the man and watching him. I do not know that he has a single grounded sort of truth infrastructure in his head. In other words, if you ask him a question today about something, he would give you an answer where he'd lay out facts, which would probably all be wrong. Ask him the same question tomorrow, you'd get a different answer. Same question next week, you'd get a different answer. There's not a coherent fact pattern in his head.
Yeah, he's a shapeshifter. He really has. There is no kind of common theme with him, and that isn't that really the definition of a populist? Is somebody who'll say anything to the group that they happen to be standing in front of. But I want to ask you something about the counterintelligence aspect to this, because as citizens and as residents and people who live in the United States, we hope that there is a group that keeps us safe from this. We would like to think that there is an organization, whether it be the FBI, that or law enforcement in some way, that protects us from authoritarianism. And yet it hasn't really been the case. And Donald Trump often talks about the fact that when he first started campaigning in 2015, 2016, that the FBI were already investigating him. Well, that's kind of true, isn't it? The FBI did identify him as being a potential Russian asset and somebody who was not an ideal candidate for president. So is that something that the FBI, is the FBI the organization, basically what I'm saying, who are protecting us from authoritarianism? They tried to in 2016. Are they doing it again now?
Oh, so I think a couple of points. I mean, one, in the run-up to the 2016 election, the Bureau was not investigating Trump. I mean, there had been this allegation that the Russians offered to help the Trump campaign. And so there was a question about, like, did that offer take place and who received that offer if it did? And so that resulted in, the cases on Mike Flynn, George Papadopoulos, Paul Manafort, Carter Page. I mean, that was the genesis of those investigations. But at the end of the day, it's a great question, and a question I don't have a good answer for, because, the FBI is not in the political business. The FBI is not in the process of, if it is a violation of law, absolutely the FBI has a role there. If it is something that a foreign nation, Russia, China, Iran, whoever, is doing, yes, the FBI has a role there. But when it comes to, a political candidate with authoritarian tendencies, that's not the Bureau's wheelhouse. And I don't know that it's anybody in the federal government's wheelhouse. Now, if there are voting rights, violations, if somebody is, illegally taking away or illegally making it harder to vote, yes, that's something that can be done. But, I've always thought Donald Trump isn't the problem. Donald Trump is the symptom of the problem. There are easily 50 plus million people who voted for him, who saw what those 4 years looked like, and who are lining up to say, yeah, give me more. You want to go further? Absolutely. Give me more of that. So this isn't some I think are blind to the truth. And I do think there are certain cult-like behaviors going on. But the reality is, at the end of the day, the problem that we've got within our society is one that we've got to figure out, what we stand for and what we believe, and what the real, again, going back to this idea of truth, what are the common things we can agree upon that we are and what we want to do? Because at the end of the day, the government is, I'm going to use a hackneyed phrase, it derives its power from the consent of the governed. And so if you have these huge swaths, I mean, I am also convinced that if Trump is reelected, there are going to be a ton of people who don't see him as a legitimate leader, particularly if he starts doing wildly abusive things. And so, those questions are questions for the population, for the democracy of the United States. And I don't know that appropriately anybody in the government has a role there. And where that, so the friction point of that for what the Bureau does do is when foreign nations are engaging in disinformation activity. And that is something, we know the Russians have and continue to do it, as well as the Chinese and the Iranians, but, nobody like the Russians. And the huge outcry from the far right about any interaction between the government and social media companies in particular, and what the nutty things that Elon Musk is saying these days about, content and what the government should or shouldn't be doing, goes to the point of, there's a fundamental reasonable question there about, Facebook and Twitter and Google cannot recruit sources overseas and get information about what the Russian intelligence services are trying to do, right? That's something the US government does, the CIA does, the FBI does. Private industry in the United States can't do that. And so to the extent there's information out there that, yes, this group, going back, the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg under a guy named, Prigozhin, who's Putin's chef, is targeting disinformation into US social media. Is that important to convey to the American people, to social media companies? In my opinion, yes, because they can't easily do that themselves. But what you see, and I think this, in my opinion, huge outcry on the right, is not because of any high-minded freedom of speech issue. It is a defensive response because they understand that in large measure, these efforts have been to the advantage of Donald Trump. And they do not want those efforts stymied in any way, shape, or form. If it were the reverse, if China was leading the world in advancing Kamala Harris's candidacy and was all over, every single bit of social media and news that we read online, I guarantee you the Jim Jordans and right-wing MAGA folks of the world would be pushing for the U.S. intelligence community to get this information and to provide it and to stifle these, pieces of disinformation on Twitter or Facebook or wherever they may be. But it's not the debate that is going on now. There is a reasonable debate. That's not what's going on. The debate that's going on is a political one to protect Donald Trump, which unfortunately, Elon Musk has bought into. And, I think a lot of the kind of crazy far right, the broligarchs is a fun term I learned not too long ago.
That's a good one. But it's also it's also the court, though. It's also the Supreme Court, because it is a Supreme Court in the tank for Trump. And if you didn't think that before and you gave them the benefit of the doubt, after Roe, you might be like, oh, okay. And then after Chevron, you're like, oh, hang on. And then after immunity, you're like, whoa, this court really is just Donald Trump's personal lawyers, it seems. So what I'm getting is that the answer that you're giving me is that there isn't an organization, the FBI, the CIA, or anybody who really is protecting us from authoritarianism. It's down to us. It's down to the vote. It's down to us recognizing that certainly in this race, Kamala Harris represents freedom and democracy, and Donald Trump represents dictatorship, authoritarianism, despotism, and that relationship with Russia. I suppose there is a glimmer of hope, and that is that on Wednesday or Thursday this week, Chuck Schumer introduced a bill in the Senate to declare explicitly that presidents do not have immunity from criminal conduct, which is, his intention is to override the Supreme Court ruling. And this is called the No Kings Act, which would apply to presidents and vice presidents. And it has more than 24 Democratic co-sponsors. So it really is down to lawmakers to keep us safe.
Yeah, and I worry that that's a little bit of performance theater. I mean, it is a noble effort. It is the appropriate effort, but I don't expect one that it won't pass. And two, even if it did pass, it would be ruled constitutional. Yeah. So again,
Schumer
point,
is not our savior, is what
it does come down to us, because of the fact, one of the impacts is, we talk about there isn't an organization in the government to protect us from authoritarians, but because of this decision, we have now a situation where an authoritarian could absolutely turn the institutions into authoritarian type, levers of power. And somebody was reading,
but they already have, Peter. They already have.
But think of this: so somebody, a colleague from the CIA, now retired, wrote an editorial talking about like all of the reforms of the 60s and 70s through the Pike and Church committees, saying, the CIA can't do domestic operations, that, if you're going to engage in covert activity, you have to brief the Congress about that there has to be these oversights. All that now is up in the air. If given this ruling, the absolute immunity of a president for official acts, who could come in and say, find his Oliver North and say, I want you to go and start using the CIA and the NSA to monitor these. Here's my enemies list of 20 folks across government and the media and private industry. I want you to break into their homes. I want you to start collecting and monitoring their emails. I want you to tell me who they're talking to in the media. And here's, by the way, I know I have immunity, but you don't, but here's your pardon in advance. So you're taken care of as well. Everybody says, well, this only applies to Trump, that all these people under him, they don't have immunity, and therefore they're going to be held in check by the law. Not if Trump pardons them. They're not. Now, he can't issue a pardon for a state violation, which there's some hope in that. But I don't think people have thought through. And this, again, to your point, if you read the Supreme Court Trump immunity decision, and I think it was Neil Gorsuch during argument said, we are writing a decision for the ages. We have to be careful. This was a custom. It was like if you walked into London to a bespoke tailor who sat there, measured you. 2 weeks later, you come back for the rough cut, tailor it up, come back in for another final. This decision was specifically tailored to Donald Trump and his cases in federal court in Manhattan, in Georgia, or in state court in Manhattan and Georgia, and federal court in DC and Florida. It touches on elements of each and every one of those things, specifically fitting his fact pattern and nowhere else. And by the way, we haven't needed a decision like this for the first 44 presidents of the United States, going back to 1776. But suddenly the Supreme Court decides they need to take this very specific fact pattern and write a convoluted, internally inconsistent decision tailored towards one man. And that man, I have no doubt, will take every advantage of that, not to evade, he will to evade prosecution now, but if he was to return to power, absolutely wield it with, abandon.
And the proof of that is that Joe Biden is not taking advantage of this immunity that he has been given. That is the proof of good against evil, effectively. I have one more question on this, and that is that, am I right in saying that there is no crime of domestic terrorism here in the US? Like, domestic terrorism, it can't be tried as possibly it should be, because, Trump with January 6th, arguably he's a domestic terrorist. He overturned or tried to overturn the election, overthrow the government, attack the Capitol. But because it's not considered a crime, because maybe, I don't know, American exceptionalism, no American is going to turn on its own country, and all the thinking was that threats would be coming from the Middle East and elsewhere, that actually we need to really kind of reform the way that these crimes can be prosecuted.
Well, it's true. There is not, when it comes to laws, right, the Title 18 criminal violations, there exist international terrorism laws that there isn't an analog in the domestic terrorism sense. Now, that's different from saying, the FBI is and does label groups as domestic terrorism groups and has domestic terrorism investigations. But when those rise to the criminal level where they're being investigated, when you see those charges, it isn't a DT or domestic terrorism statute. It is inevitably, use of a weapon of mass destruction or conspiracy charges or mail fraud charges. And the problem becomes, it's a First Amendment issue. The issue becomes when you try and enact a law. Again, we're not talking about what the FBI can investigate or not, but when it comes time to creating a charging law, a violation of criminal law, how do you define what a domestic terrorism group is? And part of that issue is because there's so many robust protections under the First Amendment to say hateful, awful but lawful, things that are racist, things that are misogynistic, things that are anti-Semitic, whatever the case may be, the First Amendment protections of those are so strong that it is difficult to then say, okay, well, how do you convey that into a domestic terrorism law? Now, we have sedition on the books. If somebody's trying to overthrow the government, those statutes exist, but it gets really hard if you were to try and take an issue on the one hand, and then two, the tools that are in place, again, in my opinion, work. If there's attempted murder or kidnapping of a federal official, like thinking of Gretchen Whitmer and the folks who had that plot in Michigan, there are statutes on the book that have been effectively, in many cases, not all, applied to domestic terrorism investigations. And so that's one. And then kind of the last thing that I think about, not the last, but another important thing I think about is, as much as we say, okay, well, we need this domestic terrorism law, it's like, well, who's defining what domestic terrorism is? And remember, and this is part of my problem with the Supreme Court, you don't write the rules for the rule follower. You write the rules for the rule breaker. Joe Biden is going to do the right thing because he follows the rules. You write the rules because when Donald Trump comes in, you want some constraint on their bad behavior. So as much as you and I might look and say, well, we need the domestic terrorism law because look at all these, the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers. Great. But then look how that domestic terrorism law would be used by President Donald Trump and Attorney General Rudy Giuliani. And the potential for abuse, again, you look at any rule, any law, don't think about how a good person would use it. Think about, and again, a new term I've learned over the past few months, Oliver Wendell Holmes had the bad man. They had the concept of how would the bad man behave? How would the bad man use this or behave in these circumstances? And so I think, again, in the domestic terrorism front, it has always been tricky because of the link to the First Amendment, but particularly when it comes to creating criminal law, it's a really problematic area that I think, my opinion, again, just mine, I think we've got the tools we need on the books already.
This is why I'm not a First Amendment guy, because I never grew up with it. We don't have it in the UK, and we certainly have domestic terrorism laws. And we also, have speech laws as well, which if you say any of the above, which you mentioned, then you could effectively be criminalized for. It's so interesting. I do think sometimes the US needs to look outside of its own borders to kind of see how other nations have evolved with these laws for decades.
Believe me, I spent a good portion of my career wishing we had an Official Secrets Act because it would make it would make the job of a lot of folks out there leaking classified information. It would make it a lot easier, as well as to prevent it from being published. I was always it was always interesting to watch if there were a leak or things happened, particularly in the UK, that it was just like, no, BBC, take it down. You can't, you will not say it. Like, okay, we won't say it. So it was it's a very different paradigm.
Very, very different. Okay, we have to take a quick break, but I want to come back and talk about the attempted assassination on Donald Trump, which caused a whole frenzy certainly for that week. We'll do that next here on The Weekend Show. We often think living a more heart-healthy life means making big, unsustainable changes. Well, with SuperBeets Heart Chews, you can get daily blood pressure support in just 2 tasty chews a day. And they even promote heart-healthy energy without the stimulants. Paired with a healthy lifestyle, the antioxidants in SuperBeets are clinically shown to be nearly 2 times more effective at promoting normal blood pressure than a healthy lifestyle alone. Heart health is very important to me. I'd like to live as long as possible to enjoy my kids in old age. Effective and clinically studied from SuperBeets, the #1 doctor, pharmacist and cardiologist recommended beet brand for cardiovascular health support. Double your potential with SuperBeets Heart Chews. Get a free 30-day supply of SuperBeets Heart Chews on all bundles and 15% off your first order by going to getsuperbeets.com and using code WEEKEND. That's getsuperbeets.com. Code WEEKEND. Most Americans think they spend around $62 a month on subscriptions, but the real number is closer to $300. That is literally thousands of dollars every year, half of which we've probably even forgotten about. Thankfully, I started using Rocket Money. They found a bunch of subscriptions that I'd forgotten about, and they helped me cancel the ones that I didn't want anymore. Rocket Money is a personal finance app that finds and cancels your unwanted subscriptions, monitors your spending, and helps you lower your bills so that you can grow your savings. Rocket Money has over 5 million users and has saved a total of $500 million in cancelled subscriptions, saving members up to $740 a year when using all of the app's features. Stop wasting money on things you don't use. Cancel your unwanted subscriptions by going to rocketmoney.com/weekend. That's rocketmoney.com/weekend. rocketmoney.com/weekend. We're back with Peter Strzok here on The Weekend Show. I'm Anthony Davis. Peter, did you ever think that Donald Trump might be the victim of an attempted assassination? I mean, it really came as a bit of a shock to everybody, didn't it? And it didn't really fit the Republicans' narrative when they discovered that the person that did it was a young white male registered Republican who'd voted for Donald Trump and voted Republican in the midterms, and seems, we don't have all the information yet, but it seems clear that he was very much a Trump supporter, as was his father. And he was using an AR-15, which is, of course, a very controversial weapon. And that caused a bit of hypocrisy as well, because, Trump was targeted with the very weapon that he celebrates and that Republican lawmakers wear pins of because they're so proud of their Second Amendment right. Just give me your reaction as a former FBI guy looking at this, because the FBI are coming up for criticism, the security services coming up for criticism. Why was this missed? There was at least 2 or 3 minutes where before the shooting that the authorities were aware of this guy on a roof just outside of this fairground environment, and yet it was allowed to happen.
Yeah, so a lot of good questions in there, starting with the last one first. I mean, it's clear that Secret Service had breakdowns in a variety of settings. Listening to the testimony earlier this week from the acting director, and of course, Secret Service director resigned, I guess, 2 weeks ago. But when you look at everything from how did he get that close on the roof? How was he not seen? How was that rooftop not secured? How were the communications not working between the locals who were responsible for that outer perimeter with the internal Secret Service detail that were closer into and around the former president? To after the shots came out, the amount of time it took him, and he's like, I guess, wait, I need my shoes. And then he needed to get his little fist pump in. The goal, and should not have been, nobody knows at that moment, is the gunman down? Are there multiple gunmen? The main thing is you get the protectee off the X as fast as possible, and that didn't happen. So when you look at it, it was not just a one-off failure. There were a series of failures which point to real systemic issues. And I think the Secret Service has been under a lot of pressure recently. I think there have been some other failures between the mass deletion of, all of their internal text messages on, January 6th to some, other things going on. I think, it's a good, proud, longstanding agency. I know many former and I assume some still current Secret Service agents who are excellent and very, very good at their job, but it is clear this never should have happened. And it needs to be fixed very quickly because we're running into the height of campaign season. Scoping back a bit, it is interesting to me to watch the fallout, in particular, given as it becomes apparent, we think, and again, you're right that it's early, there may be a lot of information still to come out, but as it appears now that the person is certainly a Trump supporter and rightward leaning, the story has died away. And, if you think, on the other hand, if this guy had been, on all kinds of Antifa chat groups and, with big, Joe Biden signs in his room, they would be talking about this nonstop in Fox and Congress, across the right-wing ecosphere. The reason it has died down, I think, in no small measure has been because of the background of the individual. And again, to your point, the big underlying issue here is the ready availability of guns, and in particular, not handguns, but long guns, weapons that you don't need, to go deer hunting or bear hunting or whatever it is you might want to do. You don't need to kick out, 20 to 30 rounds in a magazine in a very short period of time. So that is, you want to solve the problem, common sense gun reform will do a huge amount to solve the problem. But, to your first question, am I surprised? I'm not. Frankly, I'm surprised more violence has not happened sooner. I mean, we've had plenty. Look, I mean, we had Paul Pelosi attacked in his house with a hammer. We've had judges, somebody who attempted to, kill a judge and I think killed her son instead in New Jersey, if memory serves. But there is a culture of violence that Donald Trump is amplifying, has been calling, anytime you get a candidate who's talking about, I am your retribution and we're going to come and get vengeance. And it has his very first campaign event in Waco, Texas, on the anniversary of the Branch Davidian compound standoff. There is an underlying recurring messaging here of one of sort of apocalyptic violence. And so I'm very surprised there hasn't been more. I sadly don't think it's going to stop. And again, the backdrop is America's got a violent history. I mean, and everybody knows about JFK and his assassination, but, Gerald Ford had, I think, 2 attempts on his life. Ronald Reagan had an attempt on his life. We have political violence. We like to think, America's, the stable democracy, and we're not like, Iraq or some, developing nation with, racked by violence in the streets. It's, well, in reality, we've got a pretty, and then expand that to RFK and Martin Luther King. I mean, there is a sadly rich and violent history of political violence in the United States. And I am surprised it took as long as it did. So this attempt, it surprised me how nearly successful it was. It did not surprise me that it occurred. And I don't think we're done.
The component that's missing, though, Peter, with RFK and with Martin Luther King and with Ronald Reagan even, is that they themselves did not incite political violence. That they, whatever your politics, we were never as fractious then as we are now with Donald Trump. I mean, it's not any coincidence that when he delayed his evacuation so that he could get his photograph taken, and he chose the word fight and said it 4 times. He could have said peace. He could have said nothing, but he chose to say fight. Really, the next day, obviously, all of the lawmakers were coming out and saying there is no place for political violence in America. And yet, the one man who was the target is also the person who has incited political violence for about 8 years now.
Right. And continues to do so. And despite the 1 week honeymoon period where his PR people were saying, he's a changed man after this assassination attempt, and look at the changed man at the convention that didn't even make it through the end of the convention.
Well, the change was the bandage, I think.
Well, right. Yes. And now there's absolutely I nicked my ear shaving and it's visible for 2 weeks. The man had a Mike Lindell, my pillow on his head, and suddenly there's no visible damage whatsoever. But look, I think again, you're absolutely right. Donald Trump is creating a permission structure within the United States for his followers to engage in violence. And the fact of the matter is, this isn't new. You can go back and, again, look at Paul Pelosi, look at the various, judges who have been subjected to threats, look at the FBI field office who have had gunmen, get killed because they've shown up. And you go back to the first Trump administration. I mean, there were people, and the nature of people who engage in violence like this, in many cases, are on the fringes. In many cases, have mental health issues. They are not rational people. The majority of Trump supporters are not going to engage in violence in all likelihood. I mean, they just believe in the man and the movement, but they're not going to go do crazy things. But the outer periphery, the 0.1%, the 1/100% is there. And when you talk about a movement that has tens of millions of people, 1/100% is still hundreds of people. And so, this became an issue not because Trump had an attempt on his life and everybody came out and said, we need to dial this down. This became an issue because prior to that, all this violence was going on, and there was not one word trying to tone down the rhetoric from anybody in or around Trump, whether in the media, in Congress, or anywhere else. And so, again, am I glad that everybody came out and said, we need to tone down the rhetoric? Absolutely, I was. It lasted, again, a week, maybe two. There are not people out, you will not hear Mike Johnson or Marjorie Taylor Greene or Sean Hannity or anybody else saying, we need to cool the rhetoric. That's gone. It's gone. And so this isn't a real response. This is again, a politically motivated response to elevate Trump. And Trump, at the end of the day, espouses violence, encourages violence, has done that for years now, and will continue to do that, frankly, until the day he dies. Because I just think that is his nature, this aggrieved, sense of, I need to be the authoritarian. They're out to get me. We have to get them. They're coming to rape your women and steal your homes. And it is so baked into him, it isn't going to stop. And again, that's why I'm very worried about the next several months. And after that, after the election, whoever wins, I'm very worried about either people who feel emboldened because Trump won, or grieved because they feel that Trump was victimized and the election was stolen yet again, and now they've got to take matters into their own hand. This doesn't end in early November.
It doesn't end, yeah. It would be remiss of us not to mention the man who did lose his life in this shooting. And whilst the assailant missed the target, he did kill a man who was protecting his family. Two others were critically injured. I didn't really feel that Donald Trump had any emotion towards those people, let alone his own attempted assassination. And to me, that was proof that we really are dealing with a sociopath, with somebody who is so very mentally compromised. Because, there was a recording of him calling RFK Jr. that night, and he seemed quite delighted that somebody had tried to shoot him, and was talking about how it sounded like a mosquito, and he was energized and enthusiastic. And then, of course, the next day was his RNC convention, where he shows up with the solemn face and does this kind of very fake speech about how he nearly lost his life and I shouldn't be here today. It's so weird. It's so performative, and no thought really for the devastation of the family that lost a loved one in this event.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And it came out that, I think President Biden tried to call the widow of the man who was killed. And, understandably, she's like, no, I don't want to talk to you because her husband are Trump supporters. And I mean, it's a moment of grief, understand that. But the fact was that Trump had not tried to call. And it wasn't until it sort of made the news that somebody on the campaign said, oh, my God, we need to get Trump to make this call. And, you could see. And everything is always about Trump. And you're right. There's not empathy there. It is just self-absorption to the exclusion of anything else. And whether it is an attempt on his life, whether it is sitting, with the television on in the little dining room outside of the Oval Office, watching people beating the crap out of police officers on the steps of the Capitol, rapt attention, eating a hamburger while he does it, there is no ability to, in my opinion, to relate to anybody else and suffering or pain or joy. And again, talking to the, what take a little detour here from where you may want to go. The Trump campaign has, toyed around with making Kamala Harris is laughter an issue? I think they tweeted about, we'll call her Laughing Kamala. And somebody pushed back and said, when have you ever seen Trump laugh? Ever, ever. And if you have, if it was not derisive laughter at somebody as a victim, but when have you ever seen him laugh in joy? And I don't think anybody can point to that. And even, I don't think that he does it behind closed doors. And what's the side version I was going to take us on? Right when I started the Bureau, they had this project called Project Slammer. They got a bunch of psychologists together and they went out and they interviewed all these people who were incarcerated, who had been convicted of spying. Everybody from, Aldrich James to eventually, I think, Robert Hansen, but all these other folks, Nicholson, folks who are in jail, and just do a complete sort of interview series and say, okay, what are the commonalities? Are there things here that we can say these group of people who most betrayed their nation, what's the sort of profiling makeup of that? And one of the few takeaways, one of the commonalities, is that they didn't have a sense of humor. That when they went and they found all these people and they talked to their colleagues, their neighbors, one thing that showed up again and again and again is they didn't really have a sense of humor. They didn't laugh. They didn't chuckle. And again, when you go to that sociopathy and that inability, because laughter is, it's a shared joy. It's an empathetic reaction. It's an ability
built
to laugh
into
at
humanity,
yourself.
isn't it? Yeah.
And you want to share laughter, and some of it is self-deprecating humor, right? Or giving you a hard time. And if I'm giving you a hard time, you can laugh about it because we all realize it is a shared human acknowledgement of humanness. And this absence,
yes,
I think, does as much as anything to sort of shine a light on that inner ego. I don't know the right psychological term of what's going on, or not going on.
Well, it's a darkness, and it's the opposite to the lightness of Kamala Harris, whose laughter and joy is so exterior, so overt, so rooted in honesty and authenticity. Donald Trump, the only time I've seen him laugh is where he's like, he's like doing a kind of fake thing to join in. But you're right, it doesn't come from, inside. And so I was very stunned by his reaction to the attempted assassination. I was like, wow, if someone tried to shoot you, you'd be down for a week. Like you'd need to talk to a therapist. You'd certainly need to come to terms with this momentous event. And even the thing I would be more concerned about was the fact that my celebrity had caused the death of someone behind me. And I would have to deal with that. And I would really struggle with that. Nothing from him.
Right. And I think to the extent that was there, clearly the prop that they got of the gentleman's, kind of fire protective
jacket,
clothing, where he goes over and that was nothing in that, in my opinion, was genuine. That was entirely somebody saying, if there were an empathetic person, what would an empathetic person do? Hey, boss, you need to, at this point, rehearse it. You're going to go over there and, like I hug the flag. Yes. Like you hug the flag, go do that. So you're right.
It's sick. What he did was pretty sick. And yet he and that kind of Republican conference, they presented all of this stuff in such a everything, or even the policies presented in such a performative way that nobody can really tell kind of truth from fiction.
Yeah. And I think you're touching on something with the laughter and the joy that I think is a huge advantage to what Harris has now. And, Joe Biden is a kind, gentle man, has a great sense of humor is there, but I think, he is older. And I think somebody like Kamala Harris, who has that ability for infectious, enthusiastic laughter and joy, is such a strength and presents such a contrast. I mean, if your message is one of laughter, one of joy, one of hope, one of building and coming together and potential, versus this dark dystopian, they're here to rape and pillage and they're taking your jobs and we're going to, at the end of the day, and it's like for Trump's inaugural address, when George W. Bush turned, I think it was Hillary Clinton, said that was some weird shit because it was this hellscape. And I assume it was Stephen Miller, whoever wrote it.
Yes.
But that at the end of the day, even people who feel disenfranchised, people who feel like their power is slipping away, I got to believe at the end of the day, I hope and pray, at the end of the day, our humanity, shared humanity of wanting to sit around the campfire together and eat the meal and tell stories and share our commonness, outweighs this sort of beleaguered barbarians at the gate every day for decades on end.
Well, it's the negativity. It's like a negative campaign versus a positive campaign, and the positive campaigns invariably are the ones that win. And when Donald Trump talks about the U.S. being a nation in decline, I don't recognize the country that he's talking about.
Agree. And I think that is targeted towards the base. That is targeted, I think, to bring out the worst in the people. I mean, look, there's a way, there's a reasonable, like, you feel like the jobs are moving away from where you live. You think your standard of living is decreasing. You think you're not doing as well as you did when you were growing up. The answer to that is not, we're all going to hell and get your guns because we got to circle the wagons and fight. The answer is we got to come together and make, lift, to use the Chinese phrase, a rising tide lifts all boats. So let's all come together and improve the lot. And what's also interesting now with also the other dynamic with Harris now is the age. Not only do you have the positive joy versus the negative darkness, you have the positive joy of youth versus the creepy, weird grandpa who is too old, who has these dark, incoherent visions. Yeah. And so it further, again, I want to be hopeful.
He's become the old candidate, whereas before he was using those 3 years that he had over Joe Biden to kind of claim that the 3 years to him was 20 years. Can we just talk briefly about gun reform off the back of this attempted assassination? Because do you think that there will be any shift? I should probably caveat this by saying that when surveyed nationally, Americans are in favor of gun safety laws and gun reform. And even to a certain extent, what the Democrats seek to do is bring about an assault weapons ban, as was years ago. But the legislators, the Republicans in Congress and in the Senate are not down for this. Do you think that the attempted assassination using an AR-15 style weapon is going to change the conversation?
No. I think the best thing that I saw that could have been done is if the Democrats put together a law called the, Protect Donald Trump Act, and try and force Republicans to vote against it, because they would vote against it, because unfortunately the idea of gun control has been, and it wasn't always this way. I mean, this is one of the remarkable stories of the past 30 years in the National Rifle Association, how they've been able to take gun ownership and the Second Amendment and turn it into such an extraordinarily strong political issue that is so absolute that you have, again, going to the Supreme Court, crazy rulings coming out of the Supreme Court about what your rights are when it comes to gun ownership, and interpretation of what our forefathers thought in the era of, breech loading muskets compared to automatic weapons with, 30, 60, 100 round magazines and bump stocks to, create automatic weapons. There it is, in my opinion, so entrenched at this point. I don't see how we get to national gun reform. I think there's a hope that states can do it, and that hopefully, that is a little easier on a smaller scale to get together and sort of pass laws. And, and some would say, well, that Supreme Court that's what they're trying to do. They're saying, well, this is a state business, not a federal one. But the problem is, we are one nation, and the flow of everything from guns, much like agriculture or anything else, it's trivial to, go to a different jurisdiction, do things that are legal there, buy a gun, buy 10 guns, and drive it right back to your house, where you live in a state where you couldn't lawfully do that. So the short answer is I don't see gun reform coming anytime soon. I think it is a noble thing to pursue. I'm glad that Harris is pushing for that as one of her articulated goals. I think that's great. I am not, though, holding my breath.
We have to take another quick break, but I want to come back and talk about Kamala Harris as a candidate and these. She talks about two different visions for our nation. We'll do that next here on The Weekend Show. Lumen is the world's first handheld metabolic coach. It's a device that measures your metabolism through your breath, and on the app, it lets you know if you're burning fat or carbs and gives you a tailored guidance to improve your nutrition, workouts, sleep, and even stress management. All you have to do is breathe into your Lumen first thing in the morning, and you'll know what's going on with your metabolism. Then Lumen gives you a personalized nutrition plan for that day based on your measurements. You can also breathe into it before and after workouts and meals, so you know exactly what's going on in your body in real time. And Lumen will give you tips to keep you on top of your health game. Because your metabolism is at the center of everything your body does. Optimal metabolic health translates to a bunch of benefits, including easier weight management, improved energy levels, better fitness results, and better sleep. So, if you want to take the next step in improving your health, go to lumen.me/weekend to get 15% off your Lumen. That's lumen.me/weekend for 15% off your purchase. Thank you, Lumen, for sponsoring this episode. Peter Strzok, I often talk about this election being the most important ever. I think a lot of people are in agreement with that. We're on a precipice. Dictatorship versus democracy, and Kamala Harris found herself becoming a candidate in a moment. The news cycle a week or so ago was remarkable, really, wasn't it? You know, with the shooting, and then with Biden making his announcement that he was stepping aside for Kamala Harris, and the outpouring of support and love and energy for her campaign has been incredible. She raised like $100 million in the first 48 hours. I think she's doubled that now. I mean, these are unprecedented numbers. And whilst I tend not to believe polls, I do believe fundraising totals as a barometer for the kind of support that Kamala Harris has. This has spooked Donald Trump. And, you know, I think it was Anthony Scaramucci said on Thursday, I think Trump will drop out the race now. I don't personally believe that a malignant narcissist is capable of that. And of course, he's mainly running to keep himself out of prison. So that's my feeling as to why he'll stay. But let's just talk to the mood of the nation right now and the energy surrounding Kamala Harris. Now, I sense from our conversation so far that you feel that there has been America has turned a positive corner. Would I be right in saying that?
I think so. I mean, look, there's a long time to go. I mean, just under 100 days. A lot is going to happen between now and then, positive and negative, certainly including the DNC, the convention in Chicago. I think that will be a net huge positive. But I think there will be ups and downs. And I think, Harris has appropriately said, we are the underdogs, and they need to think like they're the underdogs and continue on the offense all the way through Election Day. But I do think, it is clear that there is an energy. There is this sort of foreboding about Joe Biden, the candidate, the replacement with Kamala Harris as the candidate of somebody who is younger, more energetic and charismatic. And, there are a couple of watching the Olympics now, particularly the long course things like mountain biking or biking, whatever it is, equestrian stuff. There are points in the course that are very difficult and others that are not so difficult. One of the extraordinarily early difficult things was for her to kind of bring the party together behind her, to get the major fundraisers on board, to get the grassroots supporters on board. And she's navigated that beautifully. Yes. So that first real test where everybody's like, okay, here's the first real challenge, in my opinion, navigated that top marks.
Because that's the hard stuff, isn't it, really?
I mean, and because it's all of that is extraordinarily hard. I mean, all these calls are like, oh, we should have an open convention, or, whether or not the wealthy donors are going to stand back and wait and see how things shake out, or, influential people like President Obama going to wait and maybe give his, endorsement at the convention. All those she's managed to navigate all those things, I think, in a very effective way. But there's a lot still to come. I think I'm very interested to see who she selects as her running mate. I think, if you get Pennsylvania and or Wisconsin, you're in great shape. And I love what I've heard out of Walz. Shapiro, I think, is very effective. My concern with Shapiro is the same concern I have with Harris, in that I think a lot of America remains deeply racist in a lot of ways people will not acknowledge. Now, there are overt racists, and they're already in Trump's camp. The Nick Fuentes, even to people who aren't quite that overtly racist, there is still across America people who ostensibly say, hey, I am not a bigot at all. My white brother, black brother, brown brother, we are all brothers. The reality is, when they're sitting inside their living room or sitting around the kitchen table or walking into the privacy of the voting booth, there is an undercurrent of racism that still exists, I think, in a lot more places than the coastal elites want to believe. Now, is that going to manifest itself into I, because of that, can't vote for Harris, let alone a Harris-Shapiro ticket. I hope not. And I'm heartened that the group of Americans who I think are least, racially sort of imbalanced, if you look at it as the youth, I think tend to be far more open. And if that youth vote can get out in the way that they did in the midterms in 2022, even in 2020, build on that some, it won't be a close election at all. But there is, if you had the exact same personality, and again, that's what is, in my opinion, driving this whole, you need like shopping for wine. We need a dry white male for the VP pick. But there are challenges ahead. And I love what she's doing. I am 100% behind her. I'm going to do everything in my power to ensure she is elected. But I have real concerns about the reality of what, again, step outside of the studio at CNN or MSNBC or the newsroom and editorial rooms of the Washington Post and New York Times. If you drive across America, a lot of really good people, but a lot of really entrenched racism and, frankly, traditional. Hillary Clinton couldn't get elected. Now, there are a lot, again, in my opinion, a lot of things that went into that. One of those things was that she was a woman. We have had a black president in our nation's history. We have yet to have a female president. And who was reelected and was a good president.
Yeah.
We have yet to have a woman. Now, India has had one. Israel has had one. Germany has had one. It is not, New Zealand has had one. I mean, this is not anything where it's like, oh, this is unusual to the, international democracies. But the fact of the matter is, up until 2020, America has not yet elected a woman. Well, why is that? And one of the reasons, again, in my opinion, are these sort of entrenched, not spoken about normative beliefs that, well, I don't know about a woman. And you add, I don't know about a black woman. I do worry you can't pull that. I mean, nobody's going to tell you, if you answer a poll, you're not going to say, well, yes, secretly inside, I'm actually pretty much I don't think a woman, let alone a black woman, should be anywhere near but you're not going to say that to a pollster. So I do worry whether or not how unfortunately large that sentiment may be when it comes to the voting booth. The good news is Trump is such a crazy, whack job, hateful, incompetent man with a demonstrated record of being a felon, of being an adjudged sexual assaulter. The alternative is so horrible. I do think that will overcome whatever nasty.
Well, he hasn't won anything since 2016, and I think people forget that. Is that, yes, there was huge turnout in 2020, but he didn't win. And there was way more turnout for Joe Biden. And I think that this is the thing that people forget, that Donald Trump is his own publicist. He's the one that tells us that he's popular. He's the one that tells us that he should have won. And he's the one that tells us that he's smart because his uncle was at MIT. But the reality is very different. And I personally, I don't agree with you about America not being able to elect a woman and a person of color combined. I think that they were ready to elect a female in 2016, and I blame your old boss, James Comey.
But look, but I would say in the aggregate, take a one off. Let's say, Geraldine Ferraro. I mean, there were both parties had opportunities to nominate women to be their candidate, and when they didn't succeed. And I just think, okay, was it ever going to happen through, the 1940s? Probably not. But starting in the 60s with the sexual revolution, with the Equal Rights Amendment, I would have hoped that we would have seen a much more regular nomination of women leads.
Yes.
Or at least serious representation. So again, when it comes to Clinton, I mean, I think I agree with you that a factor was Director Comey's choice, but I think there are plenty of other factors. One I also think was Russian interference, without question. But I do think this desire to not lock down the Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania band, and instead, I'm going to start going down to Arizona. I'm going to go and take the battle to these reach states, was a tactical error. And so I think none of those one things were dispositive, or the other way around. Any
but they
of those
won't
one
make
things
that
could
mistake
be dispositive,
again.
but you needed like the perfect storm, right?
Yeah, I think the Democrats probably recognize that, and I don't think they'll make that mistake again. And I also think that, Donald Trump is doing a lot to hang himself at the moment. And, if you saw his appearance in front of black journalists, and this was at the National Association of Black Journalists annual convention on Wednesday, he was expected to make an appeal to black voters. And instead, he just ended up saying, I didn't know that Kamala Harris was black, and I thought she was Indian, and went down a whole racist road that caused so much controversy. The whole planet was talking about it. I mean, if he's going to open his mouth between now and Election Day, he will lose. And that day was a perfect example of that.
Yeah, I mean, the man is clearly a racist. I mean, let's just call it, let's not speculate. The man is a racist, and that was absolutely apparent at that news conference. He is absolutely a misogynist. And whether you need to look at his behavior towards E. Jean Carroll or all these scores of women who have made credible accusations against him, he is not anybody who should come near the presidency, should not have come near the presidency. But I do think, as a result of this, I would be stunned if his handlers let him anywhere near a sort of interactive public debate ever again. He is not going to show up on a debate stage with Kamala Harris. He is not going to show up in a sort of nonpartisan interview type scenario like he had at this, the conference of black journalists. That isn't going to happen. It will be a controlled environment with Fox News anchors who will cut and paste all the crazy shit out of whatever he says to package it in interviews that they dribble out over, Hannity and Laura Ingraham or whatever, because he cannot, he can't go to any environment like that and not just readily show exactly what he is. And, the question is, will his ego let him? And I thought it was a brilliant ad. It was a brilliant speech that Harris gave and then turned into an ad.
Yes.
Where she's like, Donald, I hope you reconsider. And, if you want to say something, say it to my face.
Yeah.
And then laughs.
Yes.
And just that image, I swear and pray that every night he goes to bed with that in the front of his mind, that this person who would clean his clock in a debate, who happens to be a woman, who happens to be a black woman, who happens to be a black Indian woman, sitting there taunting him.
And a prosecutor, let's not forget that.
And a prosecutor,
yeah,
knowing that he would fail if he stepped anywhere near, but yet here is this person who is laughing at me, this lesser person. And yes, somebody was saying, well, I'll leave it at that.
Okay. He did actually say in a previous interview, or maybe I think it was actually at a rally, he said probably the truest thing the man has ever said. He said, I hate it when people laugh at me. And that really is his Achilles heel. And the fact that Kamala Harris is a professional laugher, and it forms part of her campaign, is the perfect antidote to Trumpism in a way. And we've talked about that, good against evil, darkness against light. And I do see them as the Rebel Alliance and the evil empire, to coin a Star Wars reference. But he has so many mental and emotional issues. He's so compromised that actually he just isn't cut out for this campaign. He's not doing rallies at the level that he needs to. He's playing an awful lot of golf. He is resting on his laurels. And that's why some of us are concerned that he's planning another coup and an insurrection or something with the Supreme Court where they overturn the result because his legislatures are all loyalists. This has been widely written about. And that he's maybe thinking, well, it doesn't matter if I don't win at the ballot box. I'll win with my Supreme Court.
I'm sure there's some of that calculus going on. And look, there's a lot. There have been many articles written recently talking about, plans that are being put into place by whether it is folks working within the apparatus of the state electoral processes to try and gum up the works to create legal impediments to certifying, people saying they're not going to certify the elections if it doesn't go to Trump. I think I hope two things. One is I think there's a lot of power that comes from being the incumbent. And just as Donald Trump had an advantage in 2020 because he was the president and could play a lot of these games that we saw, being out of power does not help. I mean, having the presidency and the power of the presidency, you're not going to see, Mike Flynn and Sidney Powell and Rudy Giuliani in the Oval Office encouraging Joe Biden to nationalize the National Guard to go out and seize voting machines. It's not. So that enormous power that comes with the presidency is in the hands of good and lawfulness.
Yeah. Well, it's in the hands of Joe Biden, who has immunity. So that's a good thing in this moment.
Yes, right. And who could, presume. And he won't, though. And I mean, we joke about it, and it's absolutely true, but he's not going to do it because he doesn't need immunity, because he's not going to break the law.
Yeah.
Because that's just not what any president other than Donald Trump has ever done.
Yeah.
So setting that aside, the other, I am worried about the states. I do think there are, at the end of the day, hopefully, governors who are aware of and attuned to taking care of this. Gretchen Whitmer, after I think there's a Rolling Stone article you and I were talking about just before we started taping. After that article came out with a lot of these concerns, Gretchen Whitmer said, look, the governors are aware of this, and we're ready to, make sure we have a fair and safe and accurate election. My overwhelming hope is that this election is such a landslide for Kamala Harris that it doesn't matter if one or two states are playing games, because she takes all but 60 electoral votes. That is, if people get out, if people who pay attention, and hopefully everybody is beginning to pay attention, go out and see what an old, strange, violent man is running for the presidency on the Republican side, and vote for the future of America, one or two offs aren't going to matter, because it will be a blowout. And that is what I pray for. But, we'll get there. And, there's a lot of mischief on one side, but there's a lot of motivated, talented people, on the side of democracy, including lawyers who are ready to fight back against some of this nonsense if it happens. Can the Supreme Court? If it were close, if it were one state like Florida, like they did with Al Gore,
2000, yeah.
Could they play games? Yeah. Could they do it on the scope that I think would be needed for Trump to win? I don't think so. I mean, that's my hope. And they will see the writing on the wall. And I do think, even if they want to be inclined, and you're never going to get Alito and Thomas ever. They're gone. They're, Ginny's there January 6th.
Yeah.
Alito's wife flying the flag upside down. They're gone. But I do think, at the end of the day, as much as they've helped Trump, if it comes down to pure shenanigans on a variety of fronts, they'll see the writing on the wall, understand what their legacy is, and do the right thing, I hope.
Okay. We have to finish, but Peter Strzok, thank you for joining the Weekend Show.
Thank you. It's been great.
I'm Anthony Davis. Don't forget to support me and independent journalism at patreon.com/5Minute News. See more from me on the 5 Minute News channel, and I'll be back next Sunday with a brand new special guest and more factual news to discuss on the 5 Minute News Weekend Show with Midas Touch.